Hello everybody, welcome back to Shaynan's Shelf. I am Shaynan. Today I want to talk about, and also I'm wearing the All Blacks jersey because they're about to play in like an hour and a half from me recording this. So it'll be a late night for me here in the States. They're playing in Japan today. This video will be out a couple weeks after that. Yeah, definitely should be. But I just finished this book yesterday, Spirit and Reality by Nikolai Berdyaev. And I'm only going to talk about one chapter today. In fact, when I talked about the last book I read by him, The Meaning of the Creative Act, which I've already made a video on, of course, I really only talked about one chapter for the most part as well. I have intentions to go back and go over maybe another chapter with that book, and I will probably, hopefully, do something similar with this book as well. But today, I'm just going to go over a single chapter, the one I thought was the best, and that was chapter 5. And that was on the problem of evil and suffering, which is a big problem. In fact, he recognizes it as the biggest justification for atheism. And he was writing this last century. In fact, I can't remember when this was written. It was written after The Meaning of the Creative Act. And this was originally published in 1939. So this happened right before, well, really right around World War II. Well, the last one I read, Meaning of the Creative Act, happened a couple decades before that, right before World War I. So this one, his thought has developed a bit, but he's still very much interested in spirit, the idea of spirit, as you can especially tell with the idea of this book just being called Spirit and Reality. Spirit is reality, essentially, put simply, or it ought to be. We need to stop objectivizing spirit. Stop making symbols of things, which is essentially what we always do. And there are spiritual modes that help us get out of that, and he thinks they all fall short except for one. Hence, he's also a theologian. But for Christianity, he's a Russian Orthodox guy. Although, I would say he thinks relatively contrary to lots of practitioners of Russian Orthodoxy. And he would for lots of Christian practitioners, definitely, just generally speaking. And the problem of suffering and evil. I have some notes on this, so hopefully I can keep the thoughts generally straight. Simply put, he does believe, and I do believe as well, that sin can beget suffering. But this is not all suffering. This is certainly not all suffering. Just because we suffer does not mean we did something wrong. Although that does happen. Now, he actually started off by talking about Marxism in this chapter, how he actually appreciates Marxism. I think definitely I get that idea that he appreciates Marxism to a degree because he does call out the objectification of spirit and of materialism of capitalism. But then he says Marxism was right that capitalism did that, but then it went ahead and did the same thing pretty much. It creates a new bourgeoisie. And so he's not a fan of Marxism either, really. He thinks both Marxism and capitalism are wrong for the same inherent reason, and that is they deny spirit. In fact, Marxism really thought that we can get rid of all this spirituality, all of this religion. They won't need it when they have our doctrine. And Berdyaev's like, nah, that's bogus. Like Marx is completely wrong with that. And I actually agree with that. Not that you necessarily need my opinion, but this is my channel, so I guess that happens. I am mostly trying to explain what Berdyaev himself has said. He says man is spiritual naturally. He tries to get away with it or get away from it in many ways. But because we are spiritual, and especially the one that is in tune with his in spirituality, is sensitive to evil, he will have a capacity for suffering. And because he has a capacity for suffering, he generally will seek deliverance from said suffering. And now he did go out of his way to say suffering, like deliverance from it, is not found in pessimism, like nihilism essentially, but it's also not found in optimism. In fact, his solution would be it should be found in an actively creative attitude to life. And he kind of goes over that throughout all of the writings I read by him, which is this is only my second one, so don't get me wrong, not read a lot of them. I almost assume that's going to be consistent throughout all of his writings, though, is creativity is the medium that we need to utilize, essentially, to help ourselves be in tune with proper spirit, but also, so this life doesn't suck, and maybe we can also justify ourselves as far as salvation goes. he talks about unjust suffering, which I already mentioned at the beginning. Unjust suffering is hard for people to grasp, and this is mostly, although some people have a problem with suffering just from suffering in general, even if they inflicted it upon themselves. Uh, People have a problem with unjust suffering because they don't know how to react to it. They have a tendency, though, to envelop themselves in some sort of spirituality, and he addresses a couple of these, or they have a tendency to just hate God, pretty much. And he said, and this is true in traditional Christianity too. He would say most Christians, even Russian Orthodox, are guilty of this. So even the denomination he belonged to, he would say most of us don't handle this properly. Even if we're Christians, we still don't handle this properly. And that is, we have a tendency to look at someone as deserving their suffering. There is no such thing as unjust suffering. If you suffer, it's because you deserve it. You did something wrong. And that is certainly not the case very, very often in this world. In fact, all the most horrendous things I can think of in this world were not just. The person did not deserve the suffering. He said, he talks about how the Greek tragedy kind of created this truce, this aesthetic truce with fate, and that was how they got through it. They're pretty much kind of like, it's fatalistic. It is what it is. This is just how it is, pretty much. But he does say that unjust suffering is, he does talk about Jesus Christ here for a moment. Unjust suffering is divine suffering. You don't deserve it, but it's also the suffering that, if it's handled well, can help you grow the most and become a truly spiritual creature, like you ought to be, essentially, is what he would think. He thinks that this is a problem that has to be answered strictly through the Spirit. There's a question he poses on the end of page 98 and on to 99. It is a world in which death, evil, and suffering reign supreme. And because death, suffering, and evil reign supreme in this world, is divine providence effective in this world? And he said that is a question of reason. And reason is meaningless when confronted with the mystery and secret of love. Now, he's ultimately going to say love is the answer. He does talk about the answer found in other traditions, and I'm going to agree with him actually on the love part, but I'm going to give you some other ones, and I'll tell you why he doesn't like these ones. But he's saying that the mystery of evil has always been around. Pretty much. People have always been trying to figure it out. The Greeks tried to figure it out. There are different Dionysian or Apollonian tendencies in many ways. But he even talks about the Buddhist tendency that even essentially says that being is suffering, and that they kind of seek salvation through this knowledge, this self-salvation. He doesn't I guess he could probably say he appreciates Buddhism to a degree, but he doesn't think Buddhism is the right way because it renounces personality. And he says you absolutely cannot do that. And then the Stoics are kind of in a similar vein, that they kind of just have this change of attitude, have this indifference towards suffering, but again, kind of often leads to a renouncing of personality, which, again, no bueno. And then a couple other guys that he mentions that, again, this is a problem of the spirit, and this is, I think, perhaps the most common today. But the Neoplatonists tried to deliver themselves through the intellect, and the Gnostics through knowledge, which is insufficient, essentially. And in fact, all of those ways, I would say, are, and I think he would say, are not terrible ways. They're not the best way to handle suffering and approach suffering, but they're better than the pessimistic or the just straight up even optimistic alternative, or the Marxist or the capitalistic in many ways. He says suffering is essential. Suffering is part of this life. Now, that should be obvious to anyone who's ever lived in this world, right? Suffering is part of this life. It will happen regardless if you deserve it or not. Suffering happens. Often it's unjust suffering or the divine suffering. And that is because we are free. Now, freedom is essential to Berdyaev. Spirit cannot exist without freedom. You have to be free. Now, if you're a Christian, you'll be aware, essentially, or at least maybe this isn't the denomination-wide, but that Satan's plan was essentially take away our freedom, take away our free will, so that we do not have to suffer. And that's literally not the point. That's besides the point. There is a lot of suffering in this world, but if we do not suffer, we do not have freedom, we do not learn, we do not grow, we do not become anything worth celebrating. Now, that's obviously, I think, not a really something most people want to hear unless they're Christians, maybe. Because this, of course, is a Christian answer to these things. We'll try to achieve liberation through a spiritual victory, right? And he means spirituality is possible without being a Christian. In fact, because of his answer. And he thinks that it is more humane than humanism. It is because it recognizes the absolute validity of each and every personality, only resolved, it can only be obtained through compassion and love. We do not need to renounce our personality, change our attitude like the Stoics, or just seek through knowledge and understanding and stuff like that. Those things are not bad, I do not think at all. But the answer to suffering is compassion. It is to love people. That is literally it. And he would pretty much say that is the ultimate example of that is found in Jesus Christ, which of course you're only going to believe in if you're Christian. But that is the answer even if you aren't a Christian. I think he would say it naturally leads to, if you are actually practicing such a spirituality, you will probably be naturally led to Christianity. But in many ways, because he would consider himself a Christian, but he also wasn't really practicing what a lot of other people practice. He thinks that traditional Christianity absolutely falls short on this most of the time, unfortunately. But I mean, he was disappointed by it. I'm disappointed by it. You should be disappointed by it, right? It is to bear your cross, not only though, but to help your neighbor bear his cross as well. And you only do that if you have compassion and you have love. And you also have that naturally will come with recognizing the personality of everyone else, of your own personality and of the absolute personality of everyone. That is the answer for suffering, pretty much, at least as spirit is concerned. And I actually don't really disagree with him. Feel free to, of course. Feel free to disagree with me. But please let me know your thoughts. That to maintain our personality, we have to be free. But because we're free, there also is suffering. And the way to get through the problem of evil and suffering, to really obtain that victory, is to love. That's it. Whether you're using the ultimate example of love as Jesus Christ or not, that's the answer. So, I'm Shannon. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Please, again, let me know your thoughts. I'd really like to hear it. Even if you just rip me a new one. But I do think very, very worthwhile. Very worthwhile. I mean, I think a lot of people have a tendency to seek some sort of spirituality in their life. And I don't agree with him on everything. But I think he says some things that people just need to hear in many ways. So if you're one of them, feel free to read Spirit and Reality. But I'll see you guys next time. I appreciate you being here, especially if you made it this far. And please have a good one. Thank you.